March 28, 1945, 22,000 feet above the Rhine River, Germany. Lieutenant Robert F. Johnson pulls his P-51 Mustang into a steep bank, scanning the sky through the glare of afternoon sun. His wingman, Lieutenant Carl Morrison, holds formation 300 feet to his left. They're flying escort for a bomber stream returning from Mannheim when Johnson's radio crackles to life. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high, 2 of them coming in fast." Johnson snaps his head left and sees them. 2 aircraft diving out of the cloud layer, but they're moving at a speed that makes his stomach drop. No piston engine fighter moves like that. The shapes grow larger with terrifying velocity, and within seconds he can make out their profile. Sleek, no propellers, swept wings with engines mounted underneath. Me-262s. The jets everyone's been talking about. "Brake right! Brake right!" Johnson shouts into his radio, yanking his stick hard over. The lead 262 screams past Morrison's position, missing him by less than 50 yards. Johnson catches a glimpse of the jet's fuselage as it blows through our formation. Gray camouflage, black crosses, 4 30mm cannons clustered in the nose. Then it's gone, already 1,000 feet ahead and climbing. The second jet follows its leader, and both aircraft arc upward in a climb that no American fighter can match. Morrison's voice comes through shaky. "Jesus Christ, did you see how fast those things were?" Johnson doesn't answer. He's too busy watching the jets level off at 28,000 feet, well above the bomber stream. The 2 German pilots circle once, clearly assessing the situation. Johnson counts 12 P-51s in the area. The German pilots seem to be calculating whether they want to press an attack through that kind of opposition. Then something unexpected happens. The trailing Me-262 begins a slow, wide turn, and Johnson sees an opportunity. The jet's fast in a straight line, that's obvious, but in this turn, it's not pulling away with the same shocking speed. Maybe, just maybe, there's a chance. "Morrison, stay with the bombers. I'm going after the trailer." "Bob, don't be crazy." But Johnson is already pushing his throttle forward, diving to build speed. He knows he can't catch an Me-262 in level flight. No one can. But if he can position himself correctly during this turn, if he can use gravity and geometry to his advantage, he might get close enough for a shot. The German pilot completes his turn and begins accelerating away. Johnson angles his dive to intercept, watching his airspeed indicator climb past 400 miles per hour. The Mustang's airframe shudders from the speed, but she holds together. He's closing the angle. The jet is still faster, but Johnson's dive is giving him the momentum he needs to make the shot. At 800 yards, the German pilot seems to notice him. The Me-262 begins a gentle turn to the left, but the pilot doesn't seem particularly concerned. Why would he be? He's in the fastest fighter aircraft in the world. Any American pilot foolish enough to chase him will simply watch him disappear into the distance. But Johnson has closed to 500 yards now, and he's coming in from the jet's 7 o'clock position, slightly behind and to the left. He centers the gunsight pipper on the 262's fuselage and squeezes the trigger. 6.5 caliber machine guns roar to life, sending a stream of tracers towards the jet. The first burst falls short. Johnson adjusts his aim, leading the target more. His second burst walks closer. A few rounds might have connected. He sees what looks like sparks near the jet's left wing. That's when something strange happens. The German pilot doesn't react. Not immediately. The Me-262 continues its gentle turn for another full second before suddenly rolling hard right and accelerating away. In that brief moment of hesitation, Johnson gets close enough to see something that will puzzle him for weeks to come. The German pilot's head never turned. Through the jet's cockpit, visible for just an instant before the 262 rocketed out of range, Johnson could see the pilot's helmet. The man was looking straight ahead the entire time. Even as bullets stitched across his aircraft's tail section, he hadn't looked back. He couldn't have seen Johnson's Mustang until it was almost too late. Morrison's voice breaks through on the radio. "Did you hit him?" "Maybe, but something's weird about that jet." The pilot never looked back. Not once. 3 days later, Johnson sits in the briefing room at Bodney Airfield, listening to Captain Frank Hayes describe a nearly identical encounter. Hayes is a veteran with 11 confirmed kills, and he's not the type to exaggerate. He says, "I came up behind one over Frankfurt, had him dead to rights at 600 yards, started firing, saw strikes on his tail. The jet kept flying straight for at least 2 seconds before he reacted. It was like he didn't know I was there until I hit him." Major William Kramer, the squadron intelligence officer, leans forward. "You're saying the pilot didn't take evasive action?" "Not immediately. He dove away once he figured it out, but there was this delay. Like he was surprised." He shakes his head. "These jets are supposed to be cutting edge. How does a pilot get surprised by someone on his tail?" Johnson speaks up from the back row. "I saw the same thing on the 28th. The German pilot never looked back. I watched his head through the cockpit. He was facing forward the entire time." Kramer makes a note on his clipboard. "Anyone else notice this?" 2 more pilots raise their hands. Lieutenant George Parker describes an engagement over Casal, where he managed to damage an Me-262 that seemed completely unaware of his approach until his tracers started hitting it. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan tells a similar story from a mission to Leipzig. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. 4 separate encounters, 4 different Me-262s, and in each case, the German pilots showed a delayed reaction to threats from behind. They eventually escaped. The jets are simply too fast to catch once they realize they're being attacked, but that fundamental problem remains. German jet pilots struggle to maintain awareness of what's behind them. On April 15th, the mystery begins to unravel. A damaged Me-262 makes an emergency landing at a forward Allied airfield near Liège, Belgium. The pilot, Oberlieutenant Heinrich Schwartz, is injured and unconscious. The jet is intact. Within hours, technical intelligence teams are crawling over the aircraft. They photograph every panel, every instrument, every detail. Johnson hears about the capture from Morrison, who heard it from a mechanic who heard it from someone at group headquarters. The rumor mill is working overtime. 3 days later, Johnson and Morrison are summoned to a special briefing. When they arrive, they find the room packed with pilots from multiple squadrons. Major Kramer stands at the front, next to a lieutenant colonel Johnson doesn't recognize. Behind them is a large photograph of an Me-262's cockpit. Kramer calls the room to order. "Gentlemen, I want to introduce Lieutenant Colonel James Dowd from Technical Air Intelligence. He's just returned from examining the captured Me-262 in Belgium. What he found explains a lot about what you've been experiencing in combat." Dowd steps forward and taps the photograph. "Take a good look at this cockpit. Notice anything missing." Johnson studies the image. He sees the instrument panel, the control stick, the throttle levers, the gun sight. Everything looks reasonably familiar, allowing for the differences in German design. Then it hits him. There's no rear-view mirror. Dowd lets the silence hang in the room for a moment before continuing. "That's right, no mirror, not even a small one. We've examined the captured aircraft thoroughly, checked with intelligence reports from other captured jets, and interviewed Oberleutnant Schwartz once he regained consciousness. The Me-262 has no rear-view mirror, and apparently this isn't an oversight on one particular aircraft. It's standard across the entire fleet." A pilot near the front raises his hand. "How is that possible? Every fighter we fly has at least a basic mirror. Hell, even the German FW-190s have them." "That's the question we've been asking." Schwartz was reluctant to talk at first, but he eventually confirmed what we suspected. German jet pilots have virtually no way to check their six. They have to physically crane their necks around and look behind them, which is difficult at high speed and during combat maneuvers. Morrison leans over to Johnson. "That explains everything." Dowd continues. "The Me-262's canopy design doesn't help matters. It's heavily framed, and the rear visibility is poor even if you do turn around. Add in the fact that these pilots are managing jet engines for the first time, monitoring temperature gauges, fuel flow, engine RPM, and their tasks saturated. Looking behind them becomes a lower priority, especially when they believe their speed makes them untouchable." Johnson watches as Dowd pulls out another photograph, this one showing the Me-262 from the rear quarter. The canopy's metal framing is substantial, creating blind spots. The fuselage tapers in a way that further blocks the pilot's view. It's a beautiful aircraft from an aerodynamic standpoint, but from a situational awareness standpoint, it's a death trap. We've also learned something else interesting, Dowd says. The Me-262 is not an easy aircraft to fly. It requires constant attention, especially during combat. The engines are temperamental, push them too hard, and they flame out. The aircraft has a high stall speed, which means pilots have to maintain significant velocity even during turns. All of this means the German pilots are heads down in the cockpit more often than we are. Major Kramer takes over. Gentlemen, this is actionable intelligence. The Me-262 has a critical weakness, and we're going to exploit it systematically. From this point forward, all attacks on these jets should be made from the rear quarter whenever possible. Don't try to turn with them. You can't. Don't try to catch them in a straight line. You won't. But if you can position yourself on their six during a turn, or while they're setting up an attack run on the bombers, you have a window of opportunity. He points to a diagram on the board showing attack angles. The key is patience. The jets are fast, but they can't sustain high speed in a turn. They have to slow down to maneuver, and that's when they're vulnerable. Get behind them, close to within 400 yards, and fire for effect. Even if you don't shoot them down, you'll force them to break off their attack. Over the next week, the word spreads through every fighter squadron in the 8th Air Force. The Me-262 has no rear-view mirror. The German superweapon has a blind spot, and American pilots now know exactly where it is. Johnson gets his chance to use this knowledge on April 24th. He's leading a 4-ship flight escorting B-17s to Regensburg when 2 Me-262s appear at high altitude. The jets circle above the bomber stream, clearly looking for an opening. Johnson doesn't chase them. Instead, he positions his flight between the jets and the bombers, waiting. The lead Me-262 pilot makes his move, rolling into a dive toward the lead bomber box. Johnson pushes his throttle forward and dives as well, but he's not trying to intercept. He's trying to get behind. The jet closes on the bombers at tremendous speed, its 4.30mm cannons opening fire at 800 yards. Johnson sees the tracer round streaking toward the B-17s, sees one bomber's wing erupt in flames. But the Me-262 pilot is focused entirely on his target, committed to the attack run. Johnson pulls his Mustang into the jet's wake, 600 yards back and slightly below. The jet is decelerating now, pulling out of its dive. This is the moment Kramer briefed them about, the moment when the jet pilot has to manage his energy, pull up, and prepare to escape. At 500 yards, Johnson squeezes the trigger. His first burst goes low, but he adjusts and walks the tracers up toward the jet's fuselage. He can see his rounds connecting, sparks dancing along the Me-262's left engine nacelle. Still, the German pilot doesn't react. He's pulling up, leveling off, preparing to accelerate away. Johnson fires again, a longer burst this time. More hits, concentrated on the left engine. Suddenly, there's a flash of orange flame and thick black smoke pours from the nacelle. The Me-262's nose drops slightly as the pilot realizes something is wrong. Now the German pilot tries to look back, craning his neck around in the cockpit. Johnson can see the white of the man's faceplate through the canopy, see the moment of panic as the pilot realizes he's been under attack for several seconds without knowing it. The Me-262 rolls hard left and dives, trailing smoke. Johnson follows for a moment, but the jet is still faster even with one engine damaged. It disappears into a cloud bank at 15,000 feet, and Johnson doesn't see it again. Morrison's voice comes through on the radio. "Did you get him?" "Damaged at least, maybe a kill. But you know what? He never saw me coming, not until I'd already hit him twice." The wreckage of Johnson's target is found 3 days later by advancing Allied ground forces near Nuremberg. The Me-262 crashed in a forest clearing, the pilot killed on impact. When the identification papers are recovered, Johnson learns the man's name was Lieutenant Franz Becker, age 23, transferred to jet fighters only 6 weeks earlier. The after-action report credits Johnson with his 12th confirmed kill. But Johnson doesn't feel the usual satisfaction. He keeps thinking about that moment when Becker finally looked back, when the young German pilot realized he'd been under attack for several seconds without knowing it. There's no glory in shooting down an enemy who can't see you coming. It's necessary, but it feels less like combat and more like execution. Still, the war goes on. Throughout late April and into late May, American fighter pilots continue exploiting the Me-262's blind spot with devastating effectiveness. The German jets are still dangerous, their speed and firepower remain formidable, but they're no longer the invincible threat they seemed in the early months of 1945. Pilots who once broke off engagements the moment they spotted a jet now actively hunt them, knowing that a well-executed approach from behind can neutralize the speed advantage On April 24th, Captain Frank Hayes shoots down his first Me-262 using the rear quarter attack. On April 4th, Lieutenant George Parker damages 2 jets in a single mission, both attacked from behind while they were focused on bomber formations. The tally grows. By the first week of May, American fighters have destroyed or damaged over 40 Me-262s, with rear quarter attacks accounting for nearly 70% of the successes. The Germans notice the shift. Intelligence reports from interrogated pilots reveal that Luftwaffe commanders are desperately trying to address the problem. Some units install small mirrors scavenged from damaged aircraft, mounting them awkwardly on the canopy frames. Others implement strict tactical rules requiring jet pilots to check their SICs every 10 seconds, regardless of what else is happening. But these are improvised solutions to a fundamental design flaw, and they come too late. Oberleutnant Schwartz, still recovering from his injuries in Allied custody, provides the most insight during his interrogation sessions. He's bitter about his capture, but surprisingly willing to discuss the Me-262's shortcomings. He says through an interpreter, "We told them before the aircraft entered full production, test pilots reported the visibility problem. We requested mirrors, better canopy design, anything to help us see behind. But the engineers said adding a mirror would disrupt the airflow, reduce speed by a few kilometers per hour. They said the jet's speed would make rear attacks impossible, so mirrors were unnecessary." The interrogator, a major from Air Intelligence, asks the obvious question. Were they wrong? Schwartz laughs, a harsh sound. "Look where I am. Look how many of my comrades are dead. Yes, they were wrong." Johnson hears about this interrogation from Major Kramer, who shares it during a briefing. On May 6th, the room is quiet as Kramer reads excerpts from the report. When he finishes, a young lieutenant speaks up. "Sir, did the Germans really sacrifice pilot safety for a few kilometers per hour of speed?" Kramer sets the report down. "That's exactly what they did. The Messerschmitt engineers were so focused on making the fastest fighter in the world that they forgot fighter combat isn't just about speed. It's about awareness, tactics, and keeping yourself alive long enough to use your advantages. The Me-262 is a marvel of engineering, but it's a flawed weapon because it doesn't account for the human being in the cockpit." Morrison raises his hand. "What about their new tactics, the pairs flying with mutual support?" "It helps them," Kramer admits, "but it also limits their effectiveness. If one jet has to constantly watch the other's 6, they can't both focus on attacking bombers. They're splitting their attention, reducing their lethality. It's a tactical compromise forced on them by a design flaw." The briefing shifts to other topics, but Johnson keeps thinking about Schwartz's words. The engineers said adding a mirror would reduce speed. They prioritized performance specifications over pilot survivability. It's the kind of decision that looks brilliant on paper and catastrophic in practice. That afternoon, Johnson walks out to the flight line where his Mustang is being serviced. The crew chief, Sergeant Mike Donovan, is replacing one of the wing panels damaged by flak on the last mission. Johnson climbs up on the wing and looks into the cockpit. Above the instrument panel, mounted on the canopy frame, is a simple rectangular mirror. It's not fancy, just a piece of silvered glass and a metal bracket, but it lets him see behind without turning around. Donovan notices him looking. "Something wrong with the mirror, Lieutenant?" "No, just appreciating it." The sergeant looks confused, but shrugs and goes back to work. Johnson stays there for a moment longer, thinking about Franz Becker and Heinrich Schwartz and all the other German pilots flying an aircraft that betrayed them in the most basic way possible. The Me-262 was supposed to change the war. Instead, it became a coffin with jet engines because someone decided a rear-view mirror wasn't worth the wait. On May 7th, Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is over. Johnson flies one final patrol on May 8th, a celebratory sweep over the Rhine with Morrison and the rest of the squadron. They don't see any Me-262s. Most of the jets are destroyed or grounded, their fuel supplies exhausted, their pilots scattered. 3 weeks after the surrender, Johnson finds himself at a British intelligence facility near Munich, part of a joint team evaluating captured German aircraft technology. The Allies have recovered dozens of Me-262s in various conditions, and technical experts from both the American and British Air Forces are systematically documenting everything about the jets. Johnson is there at Major Kramer's request. "You face these aircraft more than most," Kramer told him. "I want a pilot's perspective in that room when they're making their assessments." The facility is a converted Luftwaffe maintenance hangar, now filled with captured equipment. In the center of the main floor sits a pristine Me-262, one of the last aircraft produced before the collapse. Johnson walks around it slowly, seeing it up close for the first time without someone shooting at him. It's beautiful in a predatory way. Sleek lines, powerful engines, the kind of design that looks fast even standing still. A British flight lieutenant named Peter Harrington joins him. Remarkable machine, isn't it? We've had pilots test flying them. The speed is extraordinary. In level flight, nothing we have can touch it. But you can't fight a war looking only forward, Johnson says. Harrington nods. Quite right. Come with me. I want to show you something. They walk to a smaller room where engineers have laid out the Me-262's cockpit components on tables. Harrington picks up a metal frame with a small rectangular mirror attached. We found this in one of the aircraft recovered near Hamburg. The pilot had improvised it himself, welded the bracket to the canopy frame using spare parts. Poor workmanship, really, but you can see what he was trying to do. Johnson examines the mirror. It's crude, the welding rough, the mirror itself cracked, but it represents a pilot's desperate attempt to solve a problem his designers ignored. Did he survive? No, aircraft was shot down on May 3rd, but the fact that he tried tells you something, doesn't it? These pilots knew they had a problem. Over the next several hours, Johnson participates in discussions with engineers, intelligence officers, and test pilots. The assessment that emerges is damning. The Me-262 was a revolutionary aircraft, crippled by preventable flaws. The lack of rear visibility is just one issue on a long list. The engines are unreliable, requiring overhaul after just 10 hours of operation. The landing gear is weak, prone to collapse. The cockpit layout prioritizes aerodynamics over pilot efficiency. A German engineer named Klaus Weber, now working with the Allied evaluation team, provides the context. He was part of the Me-262 development program from 1943 through early 1945. We had impossible demands, he explains in heavily accented English. Faster than anything in the sky, armed to destroy bombers with a single burst, built quickly with limited resources. Something had to give. An American colonel asks the obvious question. Why not the rear-view mirror? That's a simple piece of equipment. Weber sighs. Politics, mostly. The project director. He believed mirrors were old thinking. He said jet pilots would fly differently, attack differently. Speed would be the defense. Anyone who disagreed was accused of lacking vision. He pauses. Many good engineers left the program because of this attitude. Johnson speaks up. How many pilots complained about the visibility? All of them, Weber says flatly. Every pilot who flew combat missions reported the same issue. By late 1944, the complaints became impossible to ignore. We designed a retrofit mirror assembly, submitted it for approval. It was rejected because retooling production would delay delivery schedules by 3 weeks. The room goes quiet. 3 weeks. The difference between a functional fighter and a flawed one came down to 3 weeks the Germans couldn't spare. Morrison, who had been silent until now, leans forward. How many Me-262s were built? Approximately 1,400, Weber says. Of those, perhaps 800 saw combat. And how many pilots were killed because they couldn't see behind them? Weber doesn't answer immediately. When he does, his voice is barely above a whisper. I don't know the exact number. Too many. The meeting continues into the evening, but Johnson has heard enough. He steps outside the hangar, breathing in the cool German air. The sun is setting over the mountains to the south, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere in the distance, he can hear the sound of reconstruction, hammers, saws, the slow work of rebuilding. Morrison joins him after a few minutes. You okay? Just thinking about all those pilots. German, American, British. Everyone who died in this war because someone, somewhere, made a bad decision and wouldn't admit it. The Germans made a lot of bad decisions. So did we. Not maybe with mirrors, but with other things. The difference is we could afford our mistakes. They couldn't. They stand in silence, watching the sunset. Inside the hangar, the evaluation team is still working, still documenting, still trying to understand how an aircraft so advanced could be so flawed. The Me-262 will influence jet fighter design for decades to come, but the lessons learned will be written in blood. German blood, mostly, shed by pilots who couldn't see the threats approaching from behind. Johnson returns to the United States in July 1945. He's promoted to captain, awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and assigned to a training unit in Texas. The war with Japan ends in August, and suddenly the urgency that defined the last 4 years evaporates. Pilots are being discharged by the thousands. Aircraft are being mothballed, and the massive war machine is grinding to a halt. But the lessons from Europe don't disappear. In September, Johnson is invited to Wright Field in Ohio to participate in a symposium on jet aircraft development. The Army Air Forces is planning its own jet fighter programs, and the brass wants input from pilots who have faced jets in combat. The conference room at Wright Field is filled with engineers, test pilots, and combat veterans. A brigadier general opens the proceedings by acknowledging the elephant in the room. Gentlemen, we're entering a new era of aviation. The Germans proved that jet propulsion is the future. Our job is to learn from their achievements and, more importantly, from their mistakes. Johnson is asked to present his experiences with the Me-262. He stands at the front of the room, feeling oddly nervous despite having faced death dozens of times over Germany. The Me-262 was the fastest fighter in the sky, he begins. But speed alone doesn't win fights. The German jets had a critical flaw. The pilots couldn't effectively monitor their rear hemisphere. No mirrors, poor canopy visibility, and a cockpit that demanded constant attention to engine management. We exploited this weakness repeatedly. A civilian engineer interrupts. Captain Johnson, I've read the technical reports on the Me-262. The addition of a rearview mirror would have added approximately 2 pounds to the aircraft and created minor aerodynamic disruption. Are you suggesting this small modification would have significantly changed outcomes? Johnson doesn't hesitate. Yes, sir, I'm suggesting exactly that. Give those pilots 2 seconds of warning and half of them get away. Give them 5 seconds and most of them survive. The Me-262 speed was its primary defense, but only if the pilot knew when to use it. Without situational awareness, that speed was wasted. Another voice from the back of the room. But didn't the Germans eventually adapt? Didn't they implement tactical solutions? They tried. Pair tactics, high-altitude attacks, hit-and-run strikes. But those were reactions to a fundamental design problem. They were asking their pilots to compensate for an engineering failure, and compensation only goes so far when you're managing a temperamental jet engine at 500 miles per hour while someone's shooting at you. The discussion continues for hours. Engineers debate mirror placement, canopy design, pilot ergonomics. What emerges is a consensus that American jet fighters must prioritize pilot survivability alongside performance. Speed matters, but so does the ability to survive long enough to use it. 6 months later, Johnson receives a letter from Major Kramer, who's been assigned to the jet fighter development program. Your testimony at Wright Field made an impact, Kramer writes. The new Lockheed P-80 has been fitted with improved rearview mirrors and enhanced canopy visibility. The engineers grumbled about the weight, but the test pilots backed you up. One of them told me he'd rather fly a fighter that's 5 miles per hour slower than fly blind. Johnson keeps that letter. Over the years, as American jet fighters evolve from the P-80 to the F-86 Sabre to more advanced designs, he watches the lessons from the Me-262 being implemented or sometimes forgotten and painfully relearned. The Air Force develops radar warning systems, then missile warning systems, then sophisticated threat detection networks. But through it all, even in the most advanced fighters, there's still a mirror. Sometimes it's a simple piece of glass. Sometimes it's a periscope system or a camera display. But it's always there, because pilots learned in the skies over Germany that you can't fight what you can't see. In 1952, Johnson is teaching at the Air Force Fighter Weapons School when a young lieutenant asks him about the Me-262. Sir, I've read that it was a revolutionary aircraft. You think Germany could have won the air war if they deployed jets earlier? Johnson considers the question carefully. The Me-262 was revolutionary. It was also deeply flawed. Could it have changed the war? Maybe. If they'd built thousands of them in 1943 instead of hundreds in 1945, but even then, those same design flaws would have killed German pilots. The lack of rear visibility wasn't some minor oversight. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what fighter combat requires. He pauses, remembering Franz Becker's face through the canopy, that moment of realization coming too late. The Germans built the fastest fighter in the world and forgot that fighter pilots need to see in all directions. They prioritized performance data over combat reality. That's a mistake we can't afford to repeat no matter how advanced our technology becomes. The lieutenant nods, but Johnson isn't sure the lesson has really landed. It's one of those things you have to experience to truly understand. That moment when you're behind an enemy who doesn't know you're there, that handful of seconds that means the difference between life and death. The Me-262 pilots didn't get those seconds, not because they weren't skilled or brave, but because their aircraft's designers decided situational awareness was less important than aerodynamic efficiency. Johnson retires from the Air Force in 1963. By then, jet fighters are routine, and the Me-262 is a historical curiosity, a footnote in aviation museums. But pilots still talk about it in ready rooms and officer clubs, still use it as a cautionary tale about the danger of prioritizing engineering elegance over operational reality.